We're going to follow the format of any questions or question time. I'm going to try and take as many questions as I can, so I'll be appreciative if the panelists keep their answers fairly brief, but I'm looking for an open and candid exchange of ideas, even a robust exchange of ideas. Now, the hashtag for this evening, and I'm going to have to put my reading glasses on, I've been told is hashtag views on Europe, if anyone wants to tweet. I've recently joined Twitter about 8 years after my colleague, so you can see I'm not a digital native, but if you want to follow me, I'm Jason Cowley, NS. My brief plug of the magazine I edit, The New Statesman, some of you have it in the audience. It's doing extremely well, but I'm always after more print subscribers, and we have a website if you don't fancy looking at a print edition. So, and I'm delighted to be back here, actually. It's many years since I graduated in '89, and this building has changed wonderfully. This used to be called the Debating Chamber, and I understand it's now called the Cube. Is that right? So the first question will be from Ian Edwards.
Okay, the first question, relatively gentle. What is the key reason, in your opinion, for voting in or out, and why?
So the key reason for voting in or out, and why? Desmond, can you begin, please?
John Adams, one of the fathers of the American Revolution, said that a person who would be prepared to sacrifice their liberty for prosperity would be deserving of neither. I put it to you that we aren't faced with that cruel choice, although if I were faced with it, I would undoubtedly vote for my liberty and my ability to have self-government in the United Kingdom. But I put it to you that we are faced not with that cruel choice. We can have both our liberty and our ability to govern ourselves and prosperity.
Okay. James Edwards.
Right, is this working? Excellent. Cooperation and community, to put it very simply, is probably the most important reason why you should vote to remain. If you're a student, just take a moment to think about your friends you go to university with, people you go to drink with at the Style, who you go to lectures with. Many of them are from the EU. Together, as a massive movement of 28 member states, you will meet people from backgrounds you have never had a chance to before. And the most important thing to do is get informed about this debate, because while this is just a vote for you on 23rd of June, for them it's their futures, it's their future careers. So this is about your friends, this is about the community and cooperation that the EU provides.
Okay. James Edwards. You go again. I'm joking.
No bias.
I'm going to say this with great delight. Matthew Cowley, the floor is yours, sir.
So for me, the European referendum is fundamentally an issue of democracy. Is this on? Yeah. Excellent. So when we're talking about democracy as a classical liberal ideal is about being ruled by a representative who is as close to you as is humanly possible. So it's about power being wielded by representatives that you can see, representatives you can lobby, and representatives that you can hold to account. What we have in the EU is a system where we cannot hold the people who make our laws to account. We cannot see the people who make our laws. But more importantly, by being a member of the European Union, we lose out on the ability to have a strong local government that can represent us. Because when you take powers from national government to a supranational government, national government replaces them with powers it draws up from local government, which means that local government becomes worthless. And that's what we've seen. That's what we've seen across the course of turnout over the last 20 years. Turnout in local elections is down to the mid-teens. If we leave the European Union, we can revitalize democracy in this country. We can bring back decision-making powers on our legislation to the Westminster Parliament that we elect, and then we can bring powers back on the local issues that are currently made, decisions made on them in Westminster. We can bring those back to a local level so that decisions that affect Southampton can be made in Southampton, decisions that affect the United Kingdom can be made in the United Kingdom, and we can have a true classical liberal democracy once again.
You don't think Britain's a democracy at the moment?
I don't think the EU is a democratic organisation. I think that if you look at an organisation where the entire legislative power rests with a group of 28 people that we didn't elect, and where the chief legislator is a man who was elected by 27 other people out of a possible electorate of 600 million, Jean-Claude Juncker is our chief legislator with 0.0000043% of the people in the European Union having voted for him. That's not a democracy.
There you are. You flourish some statistics and you get the first round of applause of the evening. Terrific. Alan Whitehead.
Well, we have the advantage, which is a tremendous and long-term advantage to the UK, of a single trading zone within Europe, a market of 500 million people, tremendously advantageous to Britain's prosperity and trading, and indeed the ability of the joint bloc to negotiate trading arrangements across the world with other countries jointly. And this undoubtedly has been an enormous prop to UK's prosperity, and would be an enormous loss to UK's prosperity if we were to be outside the EU, because we'd have none of that access. And remember, that access is two ways in terms of us trading with Europe as well as the rest of Europe trading with us. We are a European country, and it is right that we actually get the best advantage out of our continent by cooperating and trading with others, and building a community which is based on that, but also is a fair community as far as the conditions under which we do that. And so the protections that there exist across Europe in terms of rights in the workplace and conditions of labour that are an important part of that go along with, I think, that arrangement, which we would, I think, be very, very unwise to throw away with all that it means to us.
Alan, why does your leader seem so unenthusiastic about the European Union?
I don't think my leader is that unenthusiastic about the European Union. What our leader, I think, has been concentrating on, however, and this is one of the issues that I touched on just a moment ago, is the way that Europe actually protects the people who are working in that zone in terms of their rights and conditions in the workplace, and things such as maternity leave, paternity leave, the basis of a civilized working arrangement as far as trade and industry is concerned. And that is his particular area of concentration on the EU. Now, there obviously are a number of issues for the future, and I suspect we'll be discussing some of those this evening, about the extent to which the EU is a perfect institution, and of course it isn't a perfect institution. There's a lot that needs to be done. But I think the other point that our leader has also been concentrating on is the extent that getting those changes in the EU can be much better affected by actually being there around the table getting them done, rather than actually standing looking through the window from the outside while others take those decisions for you.
Okay. Okay. So he's. Do you think he's? Just a last question. I won't push you too hard on this, but I spoke to him last summer when he was running for the leadership, and as well as abolishing the monarchy and the public schools, he expressed grave scepticism about the European Union and said he was open-minded about leaving it.
The point of at issue now is we have a referendum with an existential choice, which is do we stay or do we go? And under those circumstances, then you clearly have to come down on one side. There isn't any sitting on the fence, and that is what Jeremy has done. And he historically has indeed had a number of concerns about aspects of the EU, and he continues to have those concerns, and quite reasonable that he does. But when that existential choice is finally made, the arguments that I've put forward, I think, are equally Jeremy's arguments as far as on the balance of all the considerations. What do you do when you have to take that final choice? And it seems to me quite clear, and certainly clear to Jeremy, that the overwhelming balance of advantage for us as a country, and certainly us as people in the workplace and making the money and doing the work in Europe, is that we stay in because of the structure that is there, which supports us and works to our advantage over the whole of Europe. And obviously we'll have a lot of discussions about what we actually mean by sovereignty, and how much sovereignty one might trade for those advantages. And that's certainly an issue as far as Jeremy has been concerned in the past.
Thank
But
you.
the reality is that actually the balance of advantage and sovereignty, I think, is very firmly placed in one direction, and that is where Jeremy has come down.
Desmond, just to come back to you on that. Alan was talking that the EU protects us. Surely we're strong enough to stand on our own, aren't we?
Well, I'm all for continuing to cooperate with the rest of Europe. We will remain Europeans. We will continue to have a huge identity of interest with the European continent, and I'm confident that we will continue to cooperate in our mutual interests. We just don't want to be governed from Brussels. And to imagine that the rest of the European continent wants to be governed in that way is quite false. They feel much more acutely the economic benefits of the European Union, but they are as opposed to us to political integration. And they voted decisively against it when the French rejected in a referendum the European Constitutional Treaty, and the Dutch overwhelmingly rejected it by 68% to 38%, and it was imposed on them anyway through the Treaty of Lisbon. Europe is going in the wrong direction. It is opposed to the democratic instincts of its own people. The elites are marching on. It needs to be brought to a halt. Your chance to bring it to a halt and bring it to its senses is on the 23rd of June.
Very good. A ripple of applause. Libby Cleaver, our second question.
What are the main problems facing the EU now, and how will they be dealt with?
Okay, the main problems facing the EU now, and how will they be dealt with? James Edwards.
The first thing I would say is the EU does face problems. You're going to hear both sides talk about certain issues of sovereignty, and I'm not going to disagree with them. There are problems with sovereignty for the EU. However, there's also benefits from that, such as pooled sovereignty. However, the main problem the EU faces at the moment is also the same problem the world faces at the moment. Instances such as climate change. Many global phenomena that the world faces is an EU problem. However, the EU is also one of the greatest solutions. The Paris Climate Conference was pushed mainly by the EU. EU countries' emissions have significantly reduced since 1992, when there was a massive push for it. So the main problems are also the EU is the main solution to them.
Matthew.
Well, I think the main problem with the European Union is the European Union. So I'll go into some specifics. It's an anti-democratic political union, a bankrupt economic union, and an unsafe security union. If we go into...
So apart from that, it's okay then, yeah?
Yeah. Other than the failing of the three main issues, we've got a lovely union. I think to go on to the idea that climate change can only be solved by the European Union, which was something that James just suggested. I think it's clear that there are 197 countries in the world, 28 of which are in the European Union. The main polluters, certainly at the moment and in the future, will be countries like China, America, India, Nigeria, Indonesia. These are not countries which are in the European Union, and unless they've recently applied for membership, they're not likely to be countries that are in the European Union. We cannot solve climate change just by being a member of a 28-nation bloc. We can solve climate change by having global cooperation, and that is exactly what we're proposing, a global cooperative movement. Britain can lead the way in promoting global cooperation. The EU has not solved problems like climate change. It has not solved problems with migration crises within its own borders. It has not solved economic problems that it was created to solve. It has not benefited the people of this country. It has not benefited the people of Europe. The main problem facing the European Union is the European Union.
Desmond.
The most obvious problem is the hugely unstable currency union and very, very profound changes and centralization of power. Fiscal powers will be required to sort that. It's already generating enormous tension. Far from harmony, just go to Greece and feel the palpable anti-German feeling. Frankly, I have great sympathy for both the Greeks and the Germans. It is the institution that is driving them apart. But hey, there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Life is uncertain. There are huge risks. Either way, all we've had is an estimate of risks by the Remain campaign on the implausible assumption that they will all turn out very badly for us, with no measurement whatsoever of the huge risks of remaining in this unstable currency union, where only we and the Danes will ultimately remain outside the union. There are huge uncertainties in life. I'm no clairvoyant as to what will happen in or out of the European Union, but I only know of one human strategy for dealing with the uncertainties of life and the world, and that is, as far as possible, to take control. Your chance to take control of our own affairs is on the 23rd of June.
Please don't forget that date. Alan.
Well, frankly, that's an extraordinary turnaround of what one might think is a question of security and insecurity by Desmond. I mean, what we certainly don't know is what the world would look like from the UK's point of view if we were dumped outside the EU itself. And surely the onus is on those who wish to leave the EU to actually map out at least a little bit of what that would look like. And whilst that doesn't directly answer the question of what are the main problems and what are the solutions to the EU, what I would suggest is that there are a number of key problems facing Europe, and not just facing the UK. That's the question of globalism, indeed the question of climate change, the question of European environment, the whole question of what is happening in other parts of the world, the question of what is happening as far as Russia is concerned, and the idea that actually you face up to those problems by running out of the bloc that is actually best placed to deal with those problems overall seems to me an inversion of what it means to be secure and insecure. And this is, I think, at the heart of some of the discussion that will come up as we go to the referendum. I mean, would being outside the EU mean that we traded with the rest of the EU, or didn't trade with the rest of the EU? And if so, on what terms? And if we had those particular terms agreed, what sort of pooled sovereignty will we have to undertake in order to continue to trade with the EU? Now, on the other hand, what happened at Paris and what has happened in terms of a number of world trade negotiations is the EU has negotiated effectively as a bloc. And so it is certainly the case as far as the climate change negotiations that the EU putting a common position on its national contributions and a common position as far as what it put on the table in terms of both protections for the climate and proposals as to how to go further was absolutely crucial in how those negotiations proceeded. And I think that perhaps illustrates why the onus is on those people to say, well, what would the mechanism look like if it wasn't like that, under the real circumstances we have in the world at the moment? And the simple idea that, well, it would all go great and we'd all trade with everybody and it would be terrific and everyone would love us, simply won't wash. I'm afraid it's got to be rather more serious than that.
Desmond, on trade, Michael Gove said this week that he wouldn't wish Britain outside of the European Union to be part of the single market. It'd have access to it, but wouldn't be a member of it. Is that your understanding of his position?
Well, my understanding of the position is this, that we run a substantial trade deficit with the rest of the European Union, and were we to leave, the Germans would not want to do without any of that Versorgungstechnik, and would continue to want to sell their cars to us. I'm quite confident that we will be able to negotiate a mutually beneficial trading agreement with the rest of the European Union. But, you know, it's this nonsense of free trade. The European Union is a customs union, not a free trade area. It encourages trade within the club and disadvantages trade with outside the club by the imposition of a common external tariff. Now, for us, where the predominance of our trade has always been and remains outside the club, that is to our disadvantage. That is why we run a trade deficit with the European Union. That is why Margaret Thatcher was able to negotiate a huge rebate on our subsidy. Now, the fact is that the trade within the European Union is predominantly manufactures and food, where we never ever had a comparative advantage. The fact is that even when we were the height of our industrial power, the workshop of the world, we had a balance of trade deficit on manufactures. Our power was always in service industries. Then it was shipping, now it's in financial services. There is no single market in the European Union in services. I'm confident that we will be able to negotiate from a position of strength a mutually beneficial agreement. They will continue to want to sell their goods to us.
Isn't that utopian, though? Because President Obama said, for example, that if the United Kingdom wished to negotiate a bilateral trade deal with the US, it would be at the back of the queue. Oh, 1 second. Do you think China would negotiate a trade deal with the United Kingdom at the present? It negotiates with the European Union.
I've got my opponent at the last general election, who came second, is a manufacturer in New Milton who exports huge amounts of high-tech equipment to China without the benefit of a trade agreement. We have a balance of trade with the United States. We're trading well, and our trade is in balance. We have no trading agreement with the United States, whether at the back of the line or the front of the queue. You do not need a trading agreement to trade. Our prosperity will depend on our initiative, our enterprise, and our hard work, whether we are in the European Union or out of it.
Alan, do you want to come back on that?
Well, they said you don't need a trade agreement to trade. I mean, it's rather helpful if you have a trade agreement to trade, I might just gently suggest. And, I mean, as far as the EU is concerned, not only is there this internal market of 500 million that Desmond has mentioned, but the EU collectively has come up with trade agreements for 50 other countries around the world, and is in the process of developing agreements with another 60. So the issue as far as where you might best be placed as far as your trading advantage is concerned seems to me rather straightforward, especially since if we were not in the EU, then depending on which way we went, we would have to renegotiate not just 28 trade agreements with the other members of the EU, but all those other trade agreements as well from a position of isolation.
But Desmond says you don't need a trade agreement to trade.
Well, Desmond indeed has said that. I think maybe you ought to have a further think about that particular statement. But hey, I'm not Desmond. But the
you sure?
But the overall issue then is, what do you do in terms of your trade overall? Desmond has said, well, he's confident that everyone will want to trade with us. I don't share that confidence, especially since whilst 44% of our exports go to the EU, only 8% of the EU's exports go to us. Actually, it's not the balance that Desmond suggests, and the most likely circumstance could be that we would need to negotiate a treaty similar to that undertaken by Norway and other countries in that similar position.
Desmond, do you want to come in?
Go into the single market, but you're not around the table.
The 40% is a completely false figure. The fact is that 40% of our trade goes through Europe because it goes to the port of Rotterdam and elsewhere beyond that.
Who's shouted not true? Do you want to come in briefly?
The point being that perhaps some goes through Rotterdam, but there's an awful lot that comes back to us from Europe.
Okay. Before I take the next question, Matthew Cowley, you're self-described classical liberal and a free trader. Do we need trade agreements to trade?
Well, I personally believe that.
They have. Your question was, what are the main problems facing? And they've talked broadly.
They haven't even attempted to answer the question.
What haven't they answered? Please come back.
My question was nothing at all to do with trade.
Go on.
Or the different differences between whether we're in or out of the common market. That was not what my question was about, and I really object to having...
Libby, what is the main problem facing EU for you?
What are the main problems facing the EU
What are the main problems for you?
Well, I have
Quickly,
listed
what are the
three.
main problems for you?
three main problems.
Right.
One of them was massive immigration.
Right, we'll come on to that.
Not even mentioned.
But that was because they chose not to mention it, but we can come on to
Crime
it.
and terrorism, not even mentioned.
Climate was mentioned and terrorism was mentioned.
And the third one was EU political ambitions. I must admit you did get that one right. But I am really annoyed that you just trot out some pre-prepared rubbish about trading when that was not what the question was about.
Right. Thank you very much. I wish I could hold them to account as you could.
Well, I would like to say, actually, we did answer your question. You just didn't like the answer that we gave, which is a different thing.
On the other hand, I'm really glad that I scored the most points.
Right, we will touch on immigration, but not yet. Question 3, Luke Arnold. Is that Arnold? Okay, so as it's written here, it's, do you think leaving the EU will compromise national security? And I'll start with James Edwards, because we haven't heard from him for a while.
Right. The answer is very simply yes. I will keep talking about cooperation. I know Mr. Swayne seems to believe we are better off alone on our small little island, is what he seems to strongly believe. However, that is not true. When it comes to crime, when it comes to international security, tell you what, 28 member states work together, sharing intelligence is always guaranteed to be better. Brussels is an instance where the EU caught both sides. Brussels actually came about because of Belgium cracking down on terrorism in its own country. But the truth is, at the end of the day, despite what Mr. Swayne believes, the UK and the world and the EU will always be safer if we act and work together.
But we are acting and working together at present, and we've had...
Exactly. Thank you for proving the EU is working.
No. What? But you're talking about security. We've had the Brussels attacks.
Yeah.
I mean, Belgium's security services are widely considered to be the worst in Europe. And you've had the Paris massacre in the present circumstances.
Yes.
You think it's as good as it can be?
I didn't say it's as good as it can be. I'm saying it's better than if we were on our own. Look, the fact of the matter is the EU perfect? Is what it's doing in terms of security perfect? The answer is no. However, and the key instance you'll keep hearing today is, these people don't believe the EU can reform. I believe it can be better, and I believe when it tackles those issues, it keeps getting better. There is a reason why, as an international community, we have had such a strong response to those instances of terrorism. That is because the pain felt by the people of Paris, felt by the people of Brussels, were felt by the people of London, were felt by the people of England, were felt across the EU as one.
Okay. Desmond, would leaving the EU compromise national security?
No, it is in our interest to continue to cooperate and share intelligence, and we will undoubtedly continue to do so. We do not require supranational institutions, a government for Brussels, to continue to do what is clearly in our identity of interest. We will remain Europeans. We will continue to empathise with the people of Paris. After all, in London, we host the 5th largest French city on the planet. As for this notion that you've introduced with respect to reforming the EU from within, on 72 occasions, we have driven our opposition to a European proposal to a vote on the Council of Ministers. On 72 occasions, we have lost.
One small version of failure to reform. However, there is constant striving for progress and change and reform happening. You can't just point to one isolated instance and say that
74.
is the norm. One isolated
Every
instance.
time.
One example, the Council of Ministers, that is one example, Mr. Swayne.
74 occasions over 20 years.
I'm a Man United fan. I could point to one result. That doesn't mean our entire season has been bad. It has been bad, but that's another issue.
I'm talking about 74 results.
On one issue.
Alan Whitehead.
Desmond, that is not the way the EU works, and you know that. The way the EU works on a lot of these issues is actually you have alliances on decisions, and those alliances then get the decision made within the EU on the basis of linkage between various states that are discussing those things, and the result comes out. If you get to a position where you are putting a vote in the way that you've described, and I don't entirely agree with your statistics overall.
House of Commons Library, comrade.
Yeah, well, I've seen the same document actually you have, but if you get to that position, that actually represents a failure on your part, not a failure on the EU's part. that actually the position where the UK on occasions has actually thrown away its linkage ability by thumping stuff on the table.
Yeah, so it was our fault for disagreeing then.
Actually, no, it's a question of the way as I said, the way the EU works is by negotiating and discussion and alliances within Europe to get a result made. And it's in general a robust and good system for getting that done. But as far as ending the position where you sometimes, by failing to negotiate those linkages in a proper way, end up being entirely isolated, is not a good way to go about negotiating in Europe in general. And I think we've seen some of those results in the way things have gone over recent years.
Okay, Matthew, security.
Well, I could come back on some of Alan's comments with the argument that we shouldn't need to be negotiating with political parties in other countries to perform legislation that affects us, but I'm not going to. I'm going to answer the question. The question was, will leaving the European Union affect our national security? Well, the answer is simple. NATO, Interpol, Europol, the G20, the G8. What I've just listed are 5 major international institutions that Britain would still be in outside of the European Union. Europol is the only one of those that our membership is European Union based, but as is well known, the United States share intelligence and share common resources with Europol, so I can't see us being thrown out. If I was to tell you that MI5 is closely following MI6 as the 2 most well-regarded intelligence agencies in the European Union, it is clear that there is no benefit to the EU to throw us out of arrangements where we share common intelligence, we share security benefits. Cooperation does not require a political union. Cooperation within Europe can happen in the European Union, it can happen outside the European Union. That is why countries like Turkey and Macedonia and Serbia already benefit from some of the security agreements that we're talking about. And also, if we look at history, and if we look at the major thing that affects national security, alliances, political alliances between countries which are likely to end up in a war with non-alliance states are the largest causes of war. If we talk about Russia, so if Russia were to invade the Baltic states, which has been something that they've been threatening to do now for the past 20 years, if Russia were to invade the Baltic states, then the entire of the 28-nation bloc of the European Union will be dragged into a war. Now that would affect our national security. If we look at the single largest cause of war throughout history, it is nationalism and oppressed nationalism. Now, if you're looking at a European Union, which its fundamental political direction is towards political integration in the United States of Europe, you're going to end up with suppressed nationalism on a level that has never before been seen. You're going to end up with people across the European Union who are going to be unhappy and are going to rise up. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about suppressed nationalism. We see it in the Basque Country in Spain and Catalonia, which is an example where there is cross-nationalism, where you can be Basque and you can be Spanish. There are very, very few people who would identify as being European first. In that case, sir, I trust you not to rise up.
A nice reply. Matthew, here's a thought. You're talking about national security. Have you considered this? You've got Putin, a very aggressive figure, menacing the eastern borders of Europe. You have collapsed states in the Middle East, Libya and Syria, and you've got the biggest influx of refugees into Europe, a refugee crisis comparable to the Second World War, what happened at the end of the Second World War. And you're asking for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union at this moment of great unease and insecurity. And by doing so, one of the big 3, UK, France, and Germany, you destabilize an already destabilized union with potentially catastrophic consequences for the European continent. Do you not consider that?
Yes. I to answer the first 2 or 3 of those points, dealing with Vladimir Putin, dealing with failed states in the Middle East, as we've already seen, that's not an issue that Europe can do alone. Let's not be isolationist, which is what we're so often accused of being in the Brexit camp. When we're talking about Putin and we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about issues that need to be dealt with by the United Nations and by NATO, which is how they're being dealt with presently. There are very few international conflicts and international disputes in which being a member of the UN Security Council doesn't enable us to still be there and be able to cooperate in the peacekeeping process in all conflicts across the world. Now, talking about destabilizing Europe, as you mentioned already, the EU is a destabilized group as it is. The EU doesn't deal with security threats as it is. It fundamentally fails to deal with attacks across the European Union and across the world.
It doesn't have a common army, but it does respond to security crises.
Yes.
It has done in relation to Russia and Ukraine, for example. So that's not correct. Anyway, that's not my role to interject. What I'm going to do, because Libby was very passionate about immigration and it's related to security, we haven't. What did surprise me, as it surprised Libby, that when we discussed the greatest problems facing the European Union, none of you spoke about the potential collapse of the Schengen, free movement within European Union. So I think we ought to touch on both the refugee crisis and then freedom of movement as it relates to immigration. So should we start with you, Desmond, on these, just so we can cover it all?
Well, we're not members of the Schengen arrangement, so we still have to show our documents when we go to France.
But isn't that a good thing for Britain?
No, I think that is a good thing that we're not members of Schengen. So the collapse of Schengen under the pressure of the migration crisis is not something that will affect us. I believe profoundly.
But isn't that crucial? You've made a crucial point, and there's a conflation, surely, by those who are wishing to leave the European Union with the refugee crisis. We don't have a refugee crisis because we're not in Schengen, and freedom of movement. They're two different things.
No, I don't conflate the two issues at all.
But many do on your side of the argument.
That's a matter for them. Let me not conflate them now for your benefit
Thank
here.
you.
I believe profoundly that a politician that ignores the issue of immigration, given that it is easily the most pressing issue that constituents raise with me, would be extremely foolish indeed. And we cannot control immigration unless we regain full control of our borders. However, having said that, let me be absolutely clear. One of the things that I like about the European Union is free movement of people. And I will have to negotiate to protect the interests of 2 million British people who are living and working abroad in the rest of the European Union. Equally, the countries of the European Union will be very keen to protect the interests of their people who are working here. I've already told you that we host the 5th largest French city on the planet. So the notion, as with everything else, that all of a sudden all sorts of things are going to come to an end and we're going to be out in the cold and out in the world, that is not the case. We will continue to cooperate where we have mutual interests, and overwhelmingly we do have mutual interests. We just don't want to share government institutions and to be controlled from a country called Europe.
Alan, just a word from you on immigration.
Well, as far as the refugee crisis is concerned, that's a crisis which is overwhelming the Middle East, and is as it were battering into Europe as a result of that crisis in the Middle East. It is not a crisis of the EU. It is a crisis that we all ought to be dealing with as a result.
Although it's a crisis for the EU because it's failed to respond to it.
It's a crisis. It's a crisis coming into the EU. It is not a crisis made by the EU. That's what I was.
Some might say it was the making of your Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair invading Iraq that destabilised the region.
One can have opinions on that, and that's perhaps
you can't blame us for Syria.
Another rather lengthy.
That could be a case of under intervention.
Another rather lengthy discussion, but the right thing to do, surely, as far as that refugee crisis is concerned, which is what Europe has been trying to do and not succeeding very well yet, is to actually produce a common position as far as who takes whom, under what circumstances, and who responds to whom is where. And of course, with the with the tremendous moves in migration that have taken place, then that's going to create substantial strains. But I would simply offer the point that sometimes looking at an ideal alternative where no one is cooperating with anybody for your own particular interests. After all, as it were, we are not going to get refugees washing up immediately on our shores because we're the furthest away of the European states from that particular central crisis. But what we can do and should do is cooperate and collaborate fully with other members of the European Union.
But we're not, Alan, we're not. Alan,
I know we are not at the moment, as far as the UK is concerned. Well, I was.
But this is a breakdown in cross-border solidarity.
I was delighted to see the change in heart as far as Syrian children were concerned just recently. But this is a crisis which will go on for many years, and is of enormous dimensions. And by the way, will be followed by further crises. May well be climate refugees, for example, over the next period. Yes. And so the ability to actually deal with those jointly, as they come up, it seems to me, is an important weapon in how those crises are dealt with. Now, the fact of the matter is that the initial EU response to that crisis was poor. But that doesn't mean that the principle of actually being able to deal with those much better on a joint basis than actually on a fractured basis is any less important for the future. Now, as far as immigration overall is concerned, of course, then we've got the question that Desmond quite rightly made about the fact that this is not one way, even in terms of the internal market. Almost 2 million UK citizens are resident in the rest of Europe. And
are you a supporter of free movement within the EU?
I am indeed, yeah absolutely. But the question I think to put back is, under the circumstances where we weren't in the EU, would those people automatically get all the rights that presently exist as far as free movement is concerned? Will we have to deal with that separately? Isn't it rather a better idea that actually we just stick with the free movement that we have within Europe and make sure we deal with it collectively well, rather than actually casting ourselves outside the whole enterprise and then try and fish around for weapons of putting it right subsequently when we've actually sold the pass on the main issue?
Okay. Desmond, just one quick response from you before we move on. One thing I don't understand is you have freedom of movement within the European Union, and therefore we cannot control the number of people coming into the country. But at the same time, the government claims it can claim control immigration by having net migration targets. Clearly, that's absurd, isn't it?
You've put your finger on you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, we only control that part of immigration that comes from outside the EU. And we've discovered today that actually 800,000 more people came here in the last couple of years from the EU than we'd previously counted. So, you can't control immigration unless you can control immigration from both within the EU and outside it.
Okay, we're going to have I understand you've got to leave, Desmond. 5 minutes, you're going on to another debate, so we'll have a quick fourth question. I may then let it run for one more question because we were slightly late starting. So forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Shruti Verma. Shruti, are you here?
Yep.
Where are you?
I'm here.
Excellent. Great to see you. Thank you.
How do you think higher education would be impacted if the UK left the EU, and how could we realistically adapt? And that's particularly with regards to research funding and study abroad programmes.
Great question, because we're in this great institution of learning. So how will higher education be affected? Very quick answers. Perhaps we should start with you, Desmond, as you're leaving in 5 minutes.
It's a matter that we would have to negotiate. I personally would be negotiating for no change. I believe that we benefit hugely, and institutions benefit enormously financially from having large numbers of foreign students and European students coming to our institutions. I know that a large number of British students like to go to Maastricht, where the teaching is in English and the fees are much lower, and who would want to stop them from doing that? But the point I come back to is the point that I've made from the start. Just because we don't want to share government institutions and want to leave an increasingly centralized European power, that does not prevent us from reaching mutually beneficial arrangements in higher education or in any other aspect of our national life.
James.
Mr. Swayne is optimistic, and I am as well, about if we left the EU, our chances for some significant renegotiation. However, where we disagree is I like to look at facts occasionally. Most importantly, I like to look at the example of Switzerland.
Are you suggesting Desmond doesn't?
I'm suggesting Desmond earlier added up 68% and 38% to get a statistic when he said how many people have voted for something, so perhaps maybe not.
So is this gentleman libelling you here?
68-32, that was the result of
You said 38,
the Netherlands referendum. If I said 38, then I'm wrong. But you've mentioned Switzerland. Very interesting.
I will finish on mentioning Switzerland
Very
first,
good.
if you don't mind. And Switzerland recently agreed to tighten up its borders back in 2012. You know what happened? They still, luckily, got access to Erasmus+, etc. You know what didn't happen? They no longer, from 2017 onwards, would get access to the exchange fund that students get entitled to. So it is a delusion to believe we will get as good a benefit as we do now. Now, many of you will have lecturers. Not many of you may like them, but you will have them at some point. And a lot of them will come from the EU. A lot of them already do. I'm a politics student. A lot of mine do. The quality of lecturers that can come into this country, teach as freely as they can, is thanks to this cooperation. And Mr. Swayne is right. Hopefully, if we leave, we will be able to get that deal. But that is not a guarantee. The same goes for research funding. The same goes to everything. At the end of the day, they'll call it scaremongering, saying that we won't get the same benefits we do now. It's not. It's called uncertainty, and it's also called the truth.
Can I just come back on Switzerland? Switzerland is a tiny country of 8 million people, and I'm confident that we can negotiate better terms than Switzerland. But just think about this. Switzerland exports to the European Union 400% per capita more than we do in the United Kingdom. They are charged as their membership fee for that privilege 20% of our fee for that privilege. If it's got to be the Swiss deal, bring it on.
Alan.
Well, I mean, the actual question was about higher education, I mean, there are some quite interesting statistics there. I mean, the 8% of the entire EU budget goes on research and promotion of science research through the EU Horizon programme.
Thank you, Desmond. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Desmond. Thank you very much, sir. Alan, please.
And that actually, in terms of Russell Group universities, for example, represents something like 12% of their overall research budgets, direct from that EU programme. And that's then added to by something like, I think, 25,000 Erasmus students. So those are real things that actually would be thrown out the window if we left the EU. Now, obviously, I'm now very used to the answer, well, of course, we'd negotiate hard on that. And I guess we might do. But I think the idea that actually the EU would actually share its hard carved out research programme with a country that was nothing to do with the EU at that point would be rather hard to come to terms with. And similarly, the end of the Erasmus programme, I think, would be almost certain at that point. And maybe we'd replace it with something else, but the reality is that would be, just those two things would be tremendously damaging for higher education in this country, particularly in terms of research, where we have such a high profile in Europe. We are a leader in research in very, very many things, and indeed a world leader in many things, and that directly contributes to that world leadership that we have.
Okay. Matthew, you're alone now, speaking for Out, so the floor is yours.
I want to come back on the question being about the future of higher education. What was the exact question? Sorry, it was something about...
Is leaving the EU... No, that's the next question. How do you think higher education will be impacted if the UK left?
Right. So I'm going to use the example of Southampton University because we're here, so I might as well use it because it's a nice example. We've got a lot of international lecturers. We've got a lot of international students. And James is quite right when he says that these people are highly skilled and these are lecturers that we wouldn't want to be taken away from us. And I quite agree. And that's why when we leave the European Union, these lecturers will still be able to come and teach in this country, because that's what happens. In America, they have highly skilled lecturers from Croatia, from Greece, from Germany, from Switzerland, from Norway. And last time I checked, the United States weren't a member of the European Union.
Do you have any facts to back that up?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well,
Perhaps you can exchange them later on, because I want to get one more question in. Do you want one more question? Yeah, okay. Daniel Dunbar, are you here? Last question.
Given the stagnant growth of the UK economic growth in the past 10 years, is leaving the EU our strongest chance at achieving impressive economic growth in the foreseeable future?
So, it's like a little hum there. Is leaving the EU our only chance of achieving impressive economic growth? Alan?
The general reckoning on what would be the result of UK leaving the EU, depending on what arrangements might be brought into place afterwards, either you join the European Economic Area, or you have individual negotiations, or indeed you just say, well, we're members of the World Trade Organization. None of those different scenarios would result in anything less than probably about between a 6 and a 10% drop in GDP over the next 15 years. That's the general calculation. Now, what that means is
Quite apocalyptic, that, isn't it?
Indeed, it is. And what that would mean in terms of the tax take that we bring forth in this country is a median loss of about 36 billion. Now, you may think that's a reasonable price to pay for complete and undiluted sovereignty, but in terms of the money that we put already into the EU, as it were, the club fee, that dwarfs the amount of money that goes into the EU at present. So we put in, at the moment, about 8 million net. We put in about 13 million and get about 4.5 billion back again. And so you imagine if you had that circumstance, what that would mean in terms of services, in terms of public funding of all sorts of things, the general ability of the country to respond in terms of its infrastructure, all those sort of things that actually are the fundamental bedrock of prosperity for the future would be, I think, seriously undermined by that loss of income and revenue over the period. And indeed, I think that's one of the fundamental things that people need to weigh very carefully in the balance, is the promise of possible negotiations for a better and more, quotes, sovereign future, easily held up against that sort of likely future if we were to leave the EU.
Matthew?
Well, I won't go so far as to say it's the only chance for increased economic growth in the future. I will, however, talk about the economic advantages of leaving. So what we're currently talking about is a customs union. As Desmond mentioned earlier, it's a customs union, which means that it's a market surrounded by a common tariff. It makes it very difficult for us to get trade with non-EU nations that are not members of that club. So what we're talking about is exclusive membership of the world's only stagnant market. We're talking about exclusive membership of a market with which our trade has declined by 20% in the last 10 years, if you take the statistics from the very same organisation that gave Alan his 6 to 8% GDP figure. So he's probably not going to quibble that one. So yeah, we're talking about exclusive membership of a declining market, a market with which our trade is declining, when what we can have instead is a relationship with the European Union based on free trade with Europe without the need for a common external tariff. And I can, if Alan would like me to, go through 27 reasons why every single one of the EU nations would agree to a free trade deal with Britain. But as I doubt that's going to be the case, I'm going to move on to talking about the countries, the kind of countries that we could be trading with. So we heard a lot about these negotiations which are theoretical, except they're not, because the Chinese premier has said that if Britain votes to leave the European Union, he'll give us a free trade deal with China. We've had.
Oh, you come on. Yeah.
That it's still.
I've had quite high sources. I know a senior ambassador in London who used to be based in Beijing, and the message when she left Beijing from China was, what is Britain without the EU? Dream on, Britain, in effect.
Well,
that's from the Chinese.
It's the 5th largest economy in the world. It's the world leader in services. It's the world leader in so many major industries. And quite frankly, if the Chinese premier is saying in a newspaper article that he's going to give, it was a newspaper article released in China. You can disagree with the Chinese premier, but I think he is probably the best source on.
I'm afraid we don't have the Chinese premier, but we'll try and get him next time. You've got the floor for the final wrap up, so please go ahead, sir.
Excellent. Well, the first thing I'd start with is on issues such as this. You've got a quick choice here between agreeing with Matt, Boris Johnson, and Donald Trump, who believe the UK's economic growth would be better off without the EU. Or you've got a choice between Barack Obama. You've got a choice between almost every world leader in, well, the world, ironically, and what they think is better for the UK economic growth. Now, I'm not as doom and gloom as Alan is, although he is right, those are legitimate statistics that Christine Lagarde has supported, that Mark Carney supports, etc. I believe the EU would still have good economic growth. I believe, however, we can be better and get more economic growth as part of the EU working towards a common goal. I believe we will be better off in the EU. Je suis European et fier de l'être. I'm European and proud to be.
But as Matthew's on his own here, I'll support him. Surely you hear from the Bank of England, you hear from Christine Lagarde. It's the establishment.
Yes, I'm sorry if it's the fact that all the business leaders in the world are the establishment, because they're also the ones who make the most money are also sometimes in the establishment. I'm sorry if the best people at the job are usually classified as the establishment, but they're also most likely to be right.
Matthew, do you want to come back briefly on this?
Well, I'd just like to come back on one thing that James said, which is this: I'm European and proud to be. Well, James, I'm European and I'm proud to be. I love European culture. I love the people of Europe. What I don't love is sharing a political union which doesn't work, sharing a political union which is anti-democratic, sharing an economic union which is bankrupt, sharing a security union which is unsafe. Being a European and identifying with European culture is not a reason to support the European Union.
You missed out just one, Matt. And being part of a culture that has given the UK and the EU the greatest time of peace in its entire history.
Because NATO didn't have an impact on
I'm
that.
proud of that, Matt.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to interject, but I hope you'll continue your debate at a future occasion in this fine building. Before we go, thank you to all the panellists for an excellent discussion. Thank you to the audience for being patient. Those excellent questions too, those who asked them. I hope you got the answers you wanted. What I'd like to have at the end here is a show of hands. So tell me, who among you favours leaving the European Union? United Kingdom leaving the European Union? I'd say, what, 8%? Would you agree? 10%? Maybe more? 15%? 20%? It's gone up. How many want to remain? I'm not allowed to have a view as the chair, but I think Remain has won this one. The vote is on the 23rd, as Desmond wishes you to know, 23rd of June. I'm editor of the New Statesman. I'm going to plug it one last time. And I'm a former graduate of this fine university. And thanks again, everyone, for coming on such a warm evening. Thank you.